The George Floyd protests are an ongoing series of police brutality protests that began in Minneapolis in the United States on May 26, 2020. The civil unrest and protests began as part of international responses to the killing of George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American man who was killed during an arrest after Derek Chauvin, a Minneapolis Police Department officer, knelt on Floyd's neck for nearly 8 minutes as 3 other officers looked on and prevented passers-by from intervening. Chauvin and the other 3 officers involved were later arrested. Local protests began in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area of Minnesota before quickly spreading nationwide and to over 2,000 cities and towns in over 60 countries in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. Polls in summer 2020 estimated that between 15 million and 26 million people had participated at some point in the demonstrations in the United States, making the protests the largest in U.S. history. While the majority of protests have been peaceful, demonstrations in some cities escalated into riots, looting, and street skirmishes with police and counter-protesters. Some police responded to protests with instances of police violence, including against reporters. At least 200 cities in the U.S. had imposed curfews by early June, while more than 30 states and Washington, D.C. activated over 96,000 National Guard, State Guard, 82nd Airborne, and 3rd Infantry Regiment service members. The deployment, when combined with already existing activations related to the COVID-19 pandemic and other natural disasters, constituted the largest military operation other than war in U.S. history. By the end of June, at least 14,000 people had been arrested. It was later estimated that between May 26 and August 22, 93% of individual protests were peaceful and non-destructive, and the Washington Post estimated that by the end of June, 96.3% of 7,305 demonstrations involved no injuries and no property damage. Nevertheless, arson, vandalism, and looting between May 26 and June 8 were tabulated to have caused $1-2 billion in insured damages. Nationally, the highest recorded damage from civil disorder in U.S. history, eclipsing the record set in Los Angeles in 1992 after the acquittal of the police officers who beat Rodney King. The protests precipitated a cultural reckoning on racial injustice in the United States and have led to numerous legislative proposals on federal, state, and municipal levels intended to combat police misconduct, systemic racism, qualified immunity and police brutality in the United States. While the Trump administration drew widespread criticism for what critics called its hardline rhetoric and aggressive, militarized response, the protests led to a wave of monument removals and name changes throughout the world. The protests occurred during the ongoing global COVID-19 pandemic and amidst the 2020 United States presidential election season. Local protests continued through 2020, primarily at George Floyd Square, and into 2021. Local officials in Minneapolis-St. Paul prepared for the possibility of continued unrest in 2021, with the trial of the 4 officers responsible for Floyd's death scheduled for March. Frequent cases of police misconduct and fatal use of force by law enforcement officers in the U.S., particularly against African Americans, have long led the civil rights movement and other activists to protest against the lack of police accountability in incidents involving excessive force. Many protests during the civil rights movement were a response to police brutality, including the 1965 Watts riots which resulted in the deaths of 34 people, mostly African Americans. The largest post-civil rights movement protest in the 20th century was the 1992 Los Angeles Riots, which were in response to the acquittal of police officers responsible for excessive force against Rodney King, an African-American man. In 2014, the shooting of Michael Brown by police in Ferguson, Missouri resulted in local protests and unrest, while the death of Eric Garner in New York City resulted in numerous national protests. After Eric Garner and George Floyd repeatedly said, "I can't breathe," during their arrests, the phrase became a protest slogan against police brutality. In 2015, the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore police custody resulted in riots in the city and nationwide protests as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. Several nationally publicized incidents occurred in Minnesota. including the 2015 shooting of Jamar Clark in Minneapolis, the 2016 shooting of Philando Castile in Falcon Heights, and the 2017 shooting of Justine Damond. In 2016, Tony Timpa was killed by Dallas police officers in the same way as George Floyd. In March 2020, the fatal shooting of Breonna Taylor by police executing a search warrant at her Kentucky apartment was also widely publicized. Measures taken against the COVID-19 pandemic, including closure of non-essential B.